May 1945. Germany has surrendered, but peace hasn't reached the ground. The morning fog drifts over a former Luftwaffe base, now turned into an Allied POW camp. Boots crunch over gravel. A truck rumbles in, brakes hissing. On its side, a faded stencil. Requisition clothing. The guards expect rough wool uniforms. What they unload instead freezes everyone. Thin, translucent fabric. Dresses that cling like mist. Line up. The quartermaster shouts. The German women, nurses, clerks, widows shuffle forward, their faces pale under the gray light. When the bundles are tossed into their hands, a stunned silence ripples through the crowd. One woman unwraps hers, holds it up. You can see her fingers through the cloth. No one speaks. Then, somewhere behind the guards, laughter. Short, embarrassed, ugly. These are prisoners of war, but they aren't soldiers. Most had served in hospitals or administrative posts, swept up by surrender. Reports later indicate that over 3,000 German women were held across Allied, run camps in Europe. Supply chaos was real: food, bedding, even soap was scarce. But to them, this wasn't logistics. It was humiliation disguised as necessity. One guard mutters, "Orders are orders." Another looks away. The women are told to change immediately. Some turn their backs, shielding each other. Others, trembling, obey. The wind picks up, tugging at the thin cloth. It's cold. Cameras click, Allied photographers documenting German POW welfare. None of the photos will mention what they wore. Among them stands a young Red Cross nurse named Hilda. She doesn't cry. She stares straight ahead, jaw tight, hands clenched at her sides. In her mind, she sees Allied prisoners she once treated. Men fed, clothed, bandaged without question. She'd followed rules too. Now she's learning what rules feel like from the other side. The quartermaster finishes roll call, notes the head count, moves on. The camp settles into an uneasy quiet, broken only by the rustle of paper, thin dresses brushing against skin. Somewhere an American guard flicks his cigarette, watching Hilda longer than he should. Her eyes meet his. Neither looks away. Tomorrow, that look will change everything. The wind still smelled of diesel and ash when dawn broke again over the camp. The dresses had stiffened overnight with dust and cold. Hilda stood in line, the thin fabric clinging to her knees. Around her, women shifted awkwardly, trying to hide. But there was nowhere to go, just mud, wire, and watchtowers cutting into the pale sky. A guard's whistle pierced the air. Roll call. They stood still, lips trembling but silent. Hilda's thoughts drifted to the hospital tents months earlier. Allied soldiers on stretchers, their faces gray with fever. She had cleaned their wounds, changed their bandages, whispered, "You'll live." Now, the same side held her captive, pretending not to see her shivering. She refused to cry. Her defiance wasn't loud. It lived in her posture, in the way she met the guard's eyes without flinching. Even among humiliation, she wanted to remain human. The others drew strength from that stillness. A woman next to her, older, whispered, "You were a nurse." Hilda nodded once. "Then you know how to stand." Over 120,000 German nurses had served across the front lines, a fact lost beneath the rubble of surrender. Most weren't ideologues, just trained hands following orders under chaos. Many believed Geneva's rules would protect them. Now standing half, exposed in a camp run by those same victors, Hilda felt those rules evaporate into the morning air. A jeep rattled past, spraying mud. The American sergeant in the passenger seat, the same one who'd caught her gaze yesterday, looked away quickly. His name tag read M. Reeves. He chewed his lip, glancing at the women through the glass. He wanted to believe the dresses were a mistake. But the guilt pressed heavier than his rifle. Hilda noticed him looking, and something flickered, not trust, but recognition. He turned his eyes to the ground. She didn't move. For a brief second, the war's simplicity, good and evil, winner and loser, collapsed under the weight of human contradiction. The whistle blew again. The line marched toward the mess tent, boots sinking into wet earth. Hilda's reflection flashed in a puddle, her thin dress ghost-like against the mud. She squared her shoulders. Tomorrow, that same sergeant would face a choice no manual had ever taught him to make. Sergeant Matthew Reeves hadn't planned to end up here, not in a prisoner camp, not guarding women who looked more like refugees than enemies. He was 26, from a farm outside Columbus, Ohio, used to mornings that smelled of corn husks and coffee. But now the air smelled like rust, soap, and quiet shame. The same eyes that once watched over his sisters back home now avoided the faces in front of him. He couldn't stop seeing the nurse, Hilda. Every time she passed during roll call, he noticed her stillness. No tears, no pleading, just those gray eyes staring back, calm as if she'd already seen the worst. He wanted to say something human, "You'll get real clothes soon." Maybe, but words died in his throat. Orders were orders, and orders didn't mention decency. In the canteen that night, the men joked about the transparent uniforms. Laughter, beer, and exhaustion dulled their guilt. Hell, one said, they used to march us naked through stalag camps. Another replied, now it's their turn. The room went quiet for a second, too long, before someone changed the subject. Reeves didn't laugh. He kept picturing his mother sewing dresses from old curtains back home. Over 10 million Axis prisoners were scattered through Allied camps after victory. Supplies ran thin, discipline frayed, but for Reeves this wasn't about logistics. It was about the line between victory and cruelty blurring in real time. He'd fought Nazis in the Ardennes, seen villages burn, seen good men break. Yet nothing unsettled him like watching a woman's dignity traded for fabric rationing. That night, while walking perimeter, he heard muffled sobs from the barracks. A flashlight beam cut through the cracks inside. Women sat awake, wrapping blankets around each other, whispering prayers. Hilda sat near the door, staring at the dark outside. Reeves turned off his light. He didn't want her to see him. Or maybe he didn't want her to see his shame. The next morning, when the whistle blew again, Reeves's eyes searched the line until he found her. He thought she looked thinner, the same pale dress, the same stare, but something had changed in him. For the first time since the war ended, he questioned if they had really won. And that doubt would spread like a quiet fire through the camp. Night came early in the camp, a flat, cold darkness that smelled of damp wood and fear. Inside the barracks, the women huddled close, their breaths fogging in the thin air. The flimsy see-through dresses hung from nails along the walls, drying beside tin mugs and ration tins. Nobody talked loudly. Words traveled too fast in a place like this. At first, the whispers were about rations, who got bread, who didn't. But soon, the talk turned to the humiliation. They want to break us. One woman muttered. Another whispered back, no, they just don't care. The arguments faded into silence. Each one carried her own theory. Punishment, shortage, revenge. But all agreed on one thing. It wasn't about fabric. It was about power. Hilda sat by the small stove, mending a tear in her dress with thread pulled from her blanket. She wasn't angry anymore. She was calculating. Her nurse's mind cataloged symptoms: hunger, despair, resignation. If she stopped caring, the others would too. She glanced around the room, faces half, lit by the flicker of the stove, eyes hollow, bodies wrapped in whatever scraps they could find. Reports later described conditions like these across Europe. The International Red Cross noted multiple incidents of improper garments and inadequate protection from cold in Allied run detention camps. Nearly 50% of those sites reported critical shortages of women's clothing by late 1945. The words in the reports were sterile, inadequate issue, pending shipment. But in these wooden barracks, inadequacy meant shame. Outside, guards patrolled. Inside, Dignity was rationed in whispers. One woman, a former teacher, said quietly, "We used to think they were better than us." No one replied. The sentence hung in the smoky air until the door creaked open and a shadow crossed the threshold. An American nurse, clipboard in hand, stepped inside. Her boots crunched softly. She looked around the room at the women, at the dresses, and for a brief second her professional detachment broke. She swallowed hard. The women froze, watching her. She scribbled a note, turned, and left without a word. But that glimpse of shock, genuine, human, spread faster than rumor. Someone on the outside had seen. And tomorrow they would come again, not with blankets, but with questions. The next morning arrived sharp and cold, the kind of chill that scraped against the skin. Mud clung to the boots of every prisoner, standing in formation. A rumor had run through the camp overnight. A Red Cross inspector was coming. For the first time in weeks, the guards barked orders with nervous precision. Even the American flag on the pole looked newly adjusted, straightened for show. The gate creaked open mid-morning. A jeep rolled in, tires spitting mud. From it stepped a woman in a khaki coat, her armband marked with the familiar Red Cross. Her notebook looked heavier than her suitcase. She was here to assess conditions and welfare. The phrase sounded official, detached. But her eyes told a different story when she saw the line of women in translucent uniforms. Hilda stood in the front row, shoulders squared. The inspector's gaze swept over the group and faltered for a moment, lingering on the paper, thin fabric that clung to their bodies. She took a step closer, her pen hesitating over the page. "Why are they dressed like this?" she asked the camp commander. The commander, a broad man with perfect posture and a voice made of excuses, replied smoothly, "Temporary shortage. Requisition delay from supply depots. The war's over, ma'am, but logistics still catching up." His tone was crisp, practiced. He didn't blink. Reports later confirmed that nearly half of Allied POW camps in 1945 faced critical clothing shortages. That statistic sounded like a spreadsheet problem, but here it looked like women shivering in nylon rags. The Red Cross worker scribbled notes. Her hand trembled slightly. She glanced at Hilda, then back to the commander. "Temporary," she repeated quietly. He nodded once. "Yes, ma'am, they're being treated humanely." Behind him, a soldier laughed, just one short, nervous sound. It echoed too loudly in the silence. The inspector's jaw tightened. She closed her notebook and said, "We'll review this." Then she turned and walked back to her jeep, boots slicing through the mud. The women stood motionless as the vehicle disappeared beyond the gate. For a moment, hope flickered like a candle. Maybe something would change now. But when the lunch whistle blew, the same guards returned, the same orders barked. Paperwork would move faster than compassion. That evening Hilda whispered, "Maybe her pen will do what our words couldn't." Tomorrow she would learn if pens had power here. The Red Cross report traveled faster than any of the women ever could, through hands, desks, and typewriters, until it vanished into the machinery of post-war bureaucracy. Somewhere in Frankfurt, a clerk stamped "Received." Somewhere in London, another stamped "Filed." By the time the ink dried, the urgency had been drained from the words. In the camp, nothing changed. The women still woke before dawn, still lined up in their fragile uniforms. The dresses were no longer transparent from shock alone. They were simply part of the landscape now, like barbed wire and boredom. Even shame, repeated daily, becomes routine. Hilda didn't ask questions anymore. She watched the guards more than she spoke to them, studying the rhythms of their routines, the cigarette breaks, the mail truck arrivals, the moments when compassion flickered behind tired eyes. Every nurse learns that healing begins with observation. She was still observing. Weeks later, she overheard the Sergeant Reeves arguing near the supply shed. "The Red Cross wrote us up. Command says fix it." Someone said. Another voice answered, "With what clothes? We can't conjure cotton." Papers shuffled, boots scuffed, and then silence. The sound of a pen scratching inside an office meant another report, another promise of pending resolution. Between 1945 and 1946, thousands of civilian complaints flooded Allied offices about conditions in temporary camps. Many were archived, few investigated. Historians would later find that paperwork outlasted empathy. One British memo even noted, "Public sympathy for German detainees remains undesirable. Inside the barracks, that indifference felt heavier than hunger. The women spoke less now. Their voices had become as thin as their clothing." When someone coughed too hard, Hilda pressed her ear against their chest, counting breaths like she once did in hospitals. The rhythm was all she had to measure life by. One night, while mending a torn sleeve with a strand of hair ribbon, she found a folded scrap of paper under her bunk, a rough sketch of a jacket, drawn in pencil. Beneath it a line written in English, "Hold on." She didn't know whose handwriting it was, but she recognized the meaning instantly. The system might have buried their story, but someone inside the machine was still human. Tomorrow, she decided, she would no longer wait for rescue through paperwork. She would act. The morning mist rolled low across the yard, soft enough to hide the trembling in her hands. Hilda stood in formation like every other day, the same brittle fabric clinging to her body, but today felt different. The folded note under her pillow, "Hold on," had shifted something inside her. She didn't know if it came from a guard, another prisoner, or maybe that Red Cross woman. It didn't matter. It had reminded her of something simple, choice. When the quartermaster barked uniform inspection, she didn't move. The women around her lowered their heads automatically, eyes on the ground, but Hilda kept hers up. The officer's boots stopped in front of her. "You didn't change," he said flatly. His accent was British, clipped and cold. Hilda's voice came out steady, almost too calm. "It's torn, it's indecent. I will not wear it." The air around them froze. A few prisoners gasped. Somewhere near the gate a guard muttered, "Christ." The officer blinked once, twice, as if recalibrating the situation. Then his tone hardened. "You'll do as ordered." She didn't move, didn't flinch, just stared straight ahead. That defiance, small, silent, but undeniable, carried louder than any scream. The officer stepped closer, voice low enough for only her to hear. "Refusal means confinement. You understand that?" "I understand," she said, "but I won't cover shame with obedience." Her words weren't dramatic. They were precise, surgical, like a scalpel cutting through silence. The other women watched in stunned stillness. One reached out and grabbed Hilda's sleeve, whispering, "Please," but she didn't back down. Reports from that period show that female POW who defied orders often faced solitary confinement or food reduction. The camp's logs would later record a disciplinary note for noncompliance. It wouldn't mention courage. The officer raised his hand to signal the guards, but before he could speak, a familiar voice interrupted. "Sir, that won't be necessary." Sergeant Reeves stepped forward. His tone carried quiet authority. "She's right. The dress is ruined. Let me handle it." The officer hesitated, eyes narrowing, then nodded stiffly. The moment passed like a slow exhale. Hilda didn't thank him. She didn't need to. The look they exchanged said everything. Defiance had found its witness, and by nightfall, Reeves would risk his career to prove it. That night, rain began to fall, a steady rhythm drumming against the tin roof of the guard hut. Reeves sat alone by the lantern, his logbook open but untouched. The ink had bled from earlier pages. The humidity made everything soft except his conscience. Hilda's voice replayed in his head, "I will not wear it." 4 words sharper than any bullet he'd heard in combat. Outside, the camp was quiet except for the wind tugging at the fences. He glanced toward the women's barracks half, hidden by the fog. The thought of her sitting there in that shredded dress gnawed at him. Regulations forbade personal interference with POW discipline. The rules were clear, but rules didn't feel righteous anymore. He opened his locker and pulled out his spare field jacket, olive drab, rough wool, still damp from the rain. The sleeves were too long for her, the shoulders too broad, but it was warmth, it was decency. He hesitated at the door, then grabbed a pencil and scribbled on a ration slip, "For you, don't give it back." Sneaking across the yard felt like crossing a battlefield again, same pulse, same adrenaline. The spotlight swung lazily across the mud. He timed his steps, waited for the beam to pass, and slipped behind the barracks. Inside, faint voices murmured. He tapped the wood twice, just enough for her to know. The door creaked open a few inches. Hilda's face appeared in the sliver of light. No words, just a shared understanding. He handed her the jacket, eyes darting toward the watchtower. She took it carefully, her fingers brushing his for a second, cold skin against calloused hands. Then she nodded once, pulled it around her shoulders, and shut the door. Reeves exhaled, walking back through the mud. Each step felt heavier with what he'd just done, not because it endangered him, though it did, but because it forced him to see the thin line between enemy and equal. By morning, whispers spread. Someone gave her a uniform. One woman said, "A guard." Another whispered. No one named him, but everyone knew. Small kindness had become rebellion. In war, orders write history. In peace, conscience rewrites it. And by sunrise, that act of mercy would no longer be a secret. By sunrise, the story had already spread like smoke through dry grass. A guard gave her a coat. The sentence traveled from bunk to bunk, whispered with awe and disbelief. In a camp where warmth was rationed, kindness had become contraband. Hilda wore the jacket quietly. It hung loose on her frame, sleeves swallowing her hands. But for the first time in weeks, she felt the weight of something that wasn't shame. The other women noticed. Some smiled faintly. Others whispered prayers of thanks for a man they'd never name aloud. Acts like this had begun to multiply across Europe in those chaotic post-war months. In a dozen Allied camps, American and British nurses secretly passed fabric, soap, or food to female POW under the radar of their superiors. Reports later estimated that hundreds of detainees survived the winter of 1945 because of those unofficial kindness networks. They weren't movements, they were instincts. In this camp, the small rebellion began with Reeves's jacket. The next day, an American nurse dropped a bundle of torn bed sheets by mistake near the women's quarters. The following evening, a British guard allowed an extra minute at the water pump so the prisoners could wash properly. Every gesture was quiet, almost invisible, but each chipped a crack into the machinery of humiliation. Hilda began helping the others alter what little they had, cutting sheets into makeshift dresses, stitching seams with thread pulled from blankets. For the first time, laughter returned in whispers. Not joy, just the fragile sound of something human refusing to die. Reeves saw it happening and said nothing. Every rulebook said he should stop it, but his silence was its own act of defiance. Once he caught the camp commander watching from a distance, cigarette burning between his fingers. Their eyes met just for a second. No words, but Reeves could tell he knew. Kindness, it turned out, was harder to contain than cruelty. By week's end, an inventory audit revealed missing supplies. The paper trail would soon lead back to this corner of the camp. And for the first time, compassion had a target. The commander's office light burned late that night. His decision, by morning, would decide who paid for mercy. The commander's office smelled of wet wool and tobacco. A single lamp cast yellow light over a desk stacked with reports, requisition forms, rations, disciplinary notes. One folder sat open, stamped irregular supply loss. Beneath it, a penciled note read, "Unauthorized distribution, investigate personnel." Sergeant Reeves stood stiff at attention. Across from him, Captain Willard leaned back in his chair, eyes sharp beneath a film of fatigue. You want to explain, he said slowly, how army property keeps vanishing in your sector? Reeves kept his gaze on the wall. Maybe inventory error, sir. It's been chaotic since the Red Cross visit. Inventory error. The captain's voice hardened. Bed sheets don't evaporate, and jackets don't walk themselves into German hands. He flipped a page, the paper snapping like a gunshot. You've been in uniform long enough to know what happens when a soldier starts sympathizing. Reeves's throat tightened. He could hear rain outside, drumming on the tin roof, counting seconds between lies. Sir, I followed orders, he said finally. Kept discipline, kept peace. That's all. Captain Willard leaned forward, voice low. Discipline isn't peace, Sergeant. It's obedience. The line hit harder than intended. For a moment, neither spoke. In that silence lay everything wrong with victory, power mistaken for virtue, punishment for order. Reports from 1945 show that disciplinary actions within Allied-run camps spiked by nearly 40% after the war's end. The reasons ranged from theft and black market trade to what official documents called fraternization with enemy nationals. Compassion had become a court-martial offense. Willard closed the file. You're lucky I'm not writing this up, he said finally. But if I hear one more rumor about missing supplies, you'll be transferred east. Understand? Reeves nodded once. Yes, sir. As he turned to leave, Willard called after him. One more thing, the nurse. She's on the transfer list. Reeves froze. The captain didn't look up. Transport leaves at dawn. Outside, the rain had stopped. The camp was quiet except for the steady clank of a train coupling beyond the fence. Reeves stood in the darkness, jacket collar up, breathing the cold air until his fists stopped shaking. He knew what that transfer meant, and he knew he had one night to change it. Before dawn, the air smelled of coal and iron. Steam hissed from the line of freight cars waiting beyond the camp fence. The guards called it a transfer, but everyone knew what that meant out of sight, out of mind. Hilda stood with 20 other women, clutching a small bundle of belongings wrapped in a torn blanket. The jacket Reeves had given her was hidden beneath, pressed close against her chest like contraband warmth. Reeves watched from the loading area, his cap pulled low. He wasn't on duty, not officially, but he'd volunteered for escort supervision. Orders said he was there to maintain order. His conscience said otherwise. The platform buzzed with hurried commands. Names, numbers, move. The women shuffled forward, boots sinking into the mud. A corporal ticked boxes on a clipboard, his expression blank. Hilda's name was halfway down the list. Hilda Weber, nurse. No rank, no crime, just a line of ink between destinations. When her turn came, she looked up and met Reeves's eyes. For a second, the camp fell away, no fences, no uniforms, just two people caught in history's machinery. He wanted to speak, to promise something, but the whistle blew, slicing through the moment like a blade. The reports later described transfers like this as routine prisoner relocation. In reality, they were long journeys through chaos. Trains packed with civilians, soldiers, and refugees snaked across a broken continent, often for 5 days or more without proper rations or water. There were no seats, no windows, just wooden walls that trapped the stench of fear and sweat. Inside the car, Hilda found a corner and sat against the boards. Through a crack in the slats, she could see dawn bleeding across the horizon, pale pink over black ruins. A woman beside her whispered, "Where are we going?" No one answered. Reeves stood by the tracks as the train lurched forward. The steam cloud swallowed the platform, hissing like an animal. He raised a hand, not sure if she saw it. The world blurred, rail clanks, distant engines, the smell of smoke and loss. He'd thought his war was over. But as that train disappeared into the fog, he realized this was just another kind of battlefield. By sunset, the train would cross the border into France. By dusk, the train screeched to a halt on a French siding outside Reims. The women inside jolted awake, limbs numb, eyes swollen from the dark. When the doors slid open, a burst of cold air hit them, and with it the sound of shouting. French civilians lined the tracks, their faces a blur of anger and triumph. Some threw stones, others spat. For them, this was justice made visible. Hilda stumbled out, her thin shoes sinking into gravel. She blinked under the harsh light, clutching Reeves's jacket tighter. Around her, guards herded the women into a column. The smell of coal mixed with bitter voices. "Botch, filthy botch," someone yelled. A tomato splattered near her feet. Another hit a woman beside her square on the shoulder. The guards didn't intervene. It was a strange symmetry the occupiers now occupied, the victors savoring humiliation the same way it had once been delivered to them. Reports from 1946 confirm that over 700 German women prisoners were transferred to French labor camps under the guise of reparative work. They harvested fields, cleared rubble, and mended uniforms for an army that hated their flag. As the column moved through the town, Hilda saw something that cut deeper than insults. On a corner balcony, an old woman stood silent, watching. Her face carried no hatred, just fatigue. Their eyes met briefly, two sides of the same exhaustion. At the new camp, they were assigned barracks converted from old stables. Straw beds, no heat. The commander, a French officer with a scar across his chin, read the rules without emotion. "You will work. You will be fed. You will behave." The women nodded. But the irony wasn't lost on Hilda. These were the same words German officers once barked at foreign laborers under her nation's rule. History, she realized, didn't move in lines. It circled back, punishing everyone in its orbit. That night, she sat under the cracked roof, tracing the stitching on the American jacket. The seams had begun to fray, but it was still the only thing standing between her and the cold. Outside, the guards spoke in low French. One phrase drifted through the air: "New uniforms arrive tomorrow." She didn't know yet how cruel that irony would be. The next morning broke clear and cold, sunlight glinting off frost, coated wire. The promised uniforms arrived bundled tight in burlap, stamped with faded German lettering. When the guards slit the sacks open, a strange silence fell. Inside were stacks of field, gray fabric, each piece neatly folded and marked with the Black Eagle insignia. The women stared. It took a moment for them to understand. They were being issued clothes made from the remnants of their own army. Recycled Wehrmacht linen, captured stockpiles now repurposed for prisoners. The same cloth that once represented power and discipline had been stripped of its meaning, sewn back together as punishment. A French officer explained it without irony. "You wear what's available," he said. "War leaves no choice." His tone carried neither cruelty nor mercy, just fatigue. But to Hilda, it felt like history mocking itself. She ran her fingers along the fabric. It was coarse, heavy, still smelling faintly of oil and dust. She remembered treating wounded soldiers wrapped in similar material. Now it wrapped her, not in pride, but in contradiction. Around her, women exchanged glances. Some refused to put the uniforms on, folding them carefully beside their beds. Others wore them silently, believing resistance had already failed. Records from 1946 show that European salvage programs processed millions of tons of captured Axis materials, uniforms, boots, even tents, all repurposed for reconstruction efforts. To bureaucrats, it was efficiency. To those wearing the results, it was memory turned inside out. When Hilda finally pulled the gray jacket over her shoulders, the seam rubbed against the American wool, still beneath it. Two enemies' fabrics touching, neither belonging, the layers felt symbolic, war's ghosts stitched together, impossible to separate. That night, she sat by the barrack window, watching moonlight crawl across the floorboards. The women slept around her, their breathing soft and uneven. She took out a scrap of paper and began writing small, cramped lines in German. "We wear the past now. It scratches the skin, but warms the soul." She folded the page, hiding it beneath a loose board. It wasn't rebellion anymore. It was record, keeping, a nurse's instinct to document every wound, even invisible ones. That note would become the first page of a diary no censor could erase. Weeks turned into months, and the war's noise faded into paperwork and silence. Hilda's days were measured by chores, washing linen, patching uniforms, clearing rubble under the brittle French winter sun. But every night, after roll call, she wrote. Small pieces of paper scavenged from packaging, scraps of invoices, even the inside of ration boxes, all became pages of her secret diary. She wrote about the first day in the see-through dress, the humiliation, the laughter that cut deeper than hunger. She wrote about the Red Cross inspector who looked shocked but said little, and about Sergeant Reeves, whose act of quiet defiance became her thread of humanity. She described the train ride, the stones thrown, and the irony of wearing Wehrmacht cloth beneath a foreign sky. She didn't write with anger. She wrote like a nurse, documenting symptoms of a moral illness that had infected victors and vanquished alike. Her words were clean, factual, and unbearably calm. We are learning that shame can survive peace. One-line read. Most female POW diaries never survived. Censors seized letters and notes during camp inspections. Many women burned their pages rather than risk punishment. Of those who tried to preserve their records, only a few dozen accounts are known today. Hilda's survived by accident. One evening in early 1947, an Allied translator found her scribbling near the stove. Instead of reporting her, he asked softly, "Why write?" She answered in broken English, "Because one day, no one will believe." He nodded, said nothing more, and weeks later, when her transfer papers came through, he hid the diary in a crate marked medical supplies. Hilda never saw it again. She was sent east, released months later, and returned to a Germany that barely recognized itself. She worked in a small clinic, refused interviews, never married. People who knew her said she kept a box under her bed, locked, dented, never opened. Decades later, that same crate resurfaced during an archive audit in Munich. Inside, under yellowed gauze and rusted instruments, lay her diary, its ink faded, but legible. By then Hilda was gone, but her words remained, waiting for someone to read them aloud. Tomorrow, that someone would be a young historian, and the silence would finally break. 70 years later, the diary sits beneath glass in a quiet museum in Berlin. The ink has browned with age, the paper brittle and translucent under the lights. Visitors move slowly, reading the neat handwriting in silence. Above it, a small plaque, Diary of Hilda Weber, German nurse and former POW, 1945-1947. There are no grand words about guilt or forgiveness, just the pages themselves, whispering what history once tried to forget. A young historian discovered the diary during the Munich archive audit of 2017. She said later, it didn't read like a victim's story. It read like an X-ray, every emotion exposed, but clinically. The diary's most haunting passage was simple. We were told they stood for justice. I only learned what justice costs when I saw it wearing my reflection. The museum guide tells visitors that less than 5% of existing World War II exhibits include material about Axis female prisoners. The statistics are dry, the language careful, underrepresented narratives, post-war custody conditions. But standing in front of the glass, people don't need curatorial terms. They see a folded scrap of fabric beside the diary, a remnant of the transparent dress, faded, fragile, still faintly shimmering under the light. Among the visitors, a few veterans linger longer. One old man whispers, "I was stationed in France. We never knew." Maybe he did. Maybe he didn't. Memory has a way of rewriting itself to make survival bearable. Hilda's handwriting, still steady across those final pages, doesn't accuse anyone. It observes. She writes about fear as a language, about kindness as rebellion, and about how war never ends cleanly. It just changes uniform. Her words move differently than reports or memoirs. They carry no headline, just gravity. Outside the museum, the city hums with life, tourists with cameras, streetcars clattering, the smell of roasted chestnuts in the cold air. Inside, time stands still. People stare through the glass at the diary, realizing the reflection they see isn't hers alone. History, Hilda once wrote, is a mirror that shows what victors refuse to see. And now, decades later, her mirror stands uncovered not to shame, but to remind. Because sometimes the smallest act of humanity survives longer than any flag.